For our morning presenter. If you'd all get back to your seats, we're going to get started. And I know that you're here because you want to learn more about hybrid publishing. Hey, I'm waiting till you're in your chairs. So if you're not in your chair, you're holding up the show.
I use the latest version of
Oh, do you want to check that?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. We're making sure we're all connected so we can record this. Okay. This morning, it is my privilege to introduce Brooke Warner. Brooke is the publisher of She Writes Press and Spark Press, president of Warner Coaching Inc., and author of Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book? How to Sell Your Memoir, and the co-author of Breaking Ground on Your Memoir. Brooke's expertise is in traditional and new publishing. She is the former executive editor of Seal Press and currently sits on the boards of Independent Book Publishers Association, the Bay Area Book Festival, and the National Association of Memoir Writers. She writes a monthly column for Publishers Weekly and blogs actively on Huffington Post Books and SheWrites.com. She lives and works in Berkeley. And Brooke is amazing. So with no further ado, Brooke Warner.
Cool. I love that.
All right, thank you. And hello, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to talk, but if you're coming to my workshop, I have some visuals and we're going to get into the weeds a bit more. But for the purposes of the larger talk this morning, I'm just going to be talking about hybrid publishing, about the state of the publishing industry a little bit, and with hybrid in the mix and what that is. So just out of curiosity, most of you are publishers, is that right? Can I get a hand for if you're an author and a publisher? Okay, and then publisher only, like publishing other people but not your own work? Okay, and then for the self-published authors, like is this group kind of considering self-publishing your own work being an author-publisher? Yeah. Okay, perfect. That's excellent. I love that. All right, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, but I also wanted to ask if how many people feel like they have a little bit of a grasp on what hybrid publishing is? Okay, a fair number of you. Okay, great. So the other piece that I want to say about being here is that I sit on the board of the Independent Book Publishers Association, so you guys are an affiliate of that group. And I know that Angela Bowl has been here recently, and you have Robbie Price coming next week. And so it's awesome to represent the larger IBPA and to come to these groups. And I can't believe I've never been here before because I just live in Berkeley, so this is my first time, and I really thank you for having me. So I started in book publishing in 2000. I've always worked in the East Bay. I came into publishing as basically as an editor, entry-level editor when I was in my early 20s, and it was my first job out of college. And the story of my publishing career does kind of mirror a lot what's going on in the publishing industry right now, because I happen to come in at a pretty critical time. Around 2000, from 2000 I would say to 2005, was an explosion in the way that we thought about digital publishing. All of a sudden, within those 5 years, maybe 7 years, we went from thinking about content and story and all of the acquisitions decisions being really editorial to a total sea change. By the time I was, maybe 7 or 8 years into my career, it was all about marketing and about the author and author platform and what the author was bringing, and it felt less about story and less about what the author was actually writing and more about who the author was. And I'm sure you guys all are familiar with that story, because now that is the story of publishing. So much so that it's all about brand, it's all about author platform. And yet, because I had come into publishing in this pretty tender space, of like 2000, like in a small publishing house where it was very content driven, I saw that as my own personal mandate and mission to publish books that I thought mattered. And I was trained to be an acquisitions editor, and acquisitions editors care about content. We care about story, we care about the editorial vision, and we're not trained to think about marketing and brand and how attractive the author is. And so I was never comfortable with the shift to marketing as much as I totally understand why. So as I made my way through, working on the East Bay and North Atlantic books first, and then Seal Press second, I kind of slowly, it did take a lot of years and a lot of hits, I would say, to become pretty disillusioned with traditional publishing. And so I was in that traditional space for 13 years. I saw a lot of changes during that time, have a lot of stories to tell about why I left. But really the subject of my TEDx talk that I gave recently is about why I left. And it was this kind of huge moment that I experienced when I really, really, really wanted to acquire this book. And I was at Seal Press, it's a feminist press, and it was a book by a trans man, kind of about why family matters. And it was so perfect for our list. I really wanted it. Seemed like a slam dunk. And it was the first time ever that my publisher said to me, I just don't think that the corporate parent company wants any more books about trans issues. And so that was number one, and I was kind of like, ugh, like how many, there was that idea of kind of saturating the market, even though we had maybe 3 or 4 other trans books on the list. It wasn't like we had 50. And then within a few months, I got this book from a New York publisher, a New York agent, a kind of big deal New York agent, and this book was about makeup. And I was not excited about it at all, but I felt obligated to bring it to the editorial board because she was a big deal agent and the author had connections. And to my dismay, that book was very well received by the marketing department. They were so excited about it that I ended up spending the most money I'd ever spent on a book during my tenure at Seal Press. So those two experiences happening within a couple months of each other basically made me feel like I'm leaving. I don't like this anymore. This is not what I came here to do. I don't care about these, the books that we're putting out on the market that are all about marketing and all about brand and author, this and that. And yet, because I am educated in why all of that stuff matters, I do also spend a lot of time talking to authors about the importance of author platform and how to do that authentically and how and why to build a readership. But all of that is the context for why I left traditional publishing to start She Writes Press. And so She Writes Press is a hybrid press. And the story that I tell about hybrid and sort of, why hybrid, what is hybrid, I started She Writes Press almost 6 years ago. It's been 5.5 years. And when I first started, I didn't call it hybrid. I actually thought it was a partnership publishing company. I didn't even have a name for it because I wasn't trying to do anything except help authors get published. So in essence, I was an assisted self-publishing company, as probably lots of you have started doing. You know, you have this expertise. People saw your book maybe and said, oh my gosh, I would love for you to help me get published. Can you do that? And you go, heck yeah, I know what I'm doing, I'll do it. And that was me. You know, I was like, I'm assisting people to self-publish. However, within, I would say, 6 months of my first season, because I was giving myself seasons because I understood the publishing cycle, I had published maybe 6 books on that first season, and it was a complete disaster for me because I came out of traditional publishing, and all I could see was what was missing. All I could see were the holes. I was so frustrated by the one-on-one relationships, the data management. I thought this is completely crazy to try to have, you know, like this individual relationship with Barnes & Noble, and there's no sales force, and there's no capacity for pre-selling. Now, as you guys know, self-published authors can actually pre-sell, but 5 years ago you couldn't. And so all of these places that I saw as not measuring up to traditional publishing were what led me to seek out traditional distribution. And when we got traditional distribution, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit, that's when I realized that we were no longer self-publishing. You know, we now had this aspect to our business model that looked a lot more like traditional publishing, and yet we would never be traditional publishing because we are charging our authors to publish. And yet, you know, the other aspect of the model that's very different is that authors get 60% of net royalties, so 60% on net, and 80% of net receipts for ebooks. And so it's quite high. I mean, as I can see, you know, among my colleagues, I think it's the highest royalties offered to authors at this point for this kind of business model. And we've always really prided ourselves on being transparent about what our business model is and what we're trying to do to the industry, which of course has resulted in a lot of industry people feeling like you're not a real publisher. And, and so this space that we're in, you know, and the kind of the oddities that we confront as publishers trying to have legitimacy in this larger world of publishing has been my entire focus and mandate over these 5 years, almost unwittingly, because I didn't really set out to do anything except help people get published. But all of a sudden I realized, oh wow, this industry is incredibly discriminatory. The traditional publishing world is making decisions about what they're acquiring based solely on brand and numbers and, you know, authors' fame, and yet they're trying to act like they have the moral high ground on publishing, and that just didn't sit well with me. So in these past 5 years, I've been really, really involved in advocacy, but I didn't set out to do that. You know, it's one of these things that just kind of happened upon me because I was so honestly upset and bewildered by the reaction to what we were doing by the traditional industry. You know, lots of times saying like, no, you don't qualify for contests. No, your authors can't be members of our organizations. No, we're not going to review your books because you're not a traditional publisher and we don't believe in pay to play. And so the interesting thing is that in these 5 years, there's been a big shift. You know, we're starting to see the industry opening up more to what hybrid is doing. There's a lot more acceptance around self-publishing than there ever has been. Publishers Weekly, for instance, got rid of their pay model for reviewing. And I think that was a direct result of some of the work that I was doing of just kind of bringing to their attention this doesn't make sense. But it hasn't made an impact on other venues like Kirkus and Booklist and other publishing houses that really still have strong rules around who can apply and who can't. And so what I think is happening in the industry is that we have this like really thriving and exciting indie community, you know, of which we're all a part, and people who are super interested and invested in learning and, you know, finding projects that we're excited about, publishing stuff because we care about it, because we believe it should be published, not necessarily having this qualifying thing of, you know, well, do you have a super high number of followers on Facebook, and, you know, are you already famous, and can you prove X, Y, and Z? And so the result is that it's really the indie publishing community that is bringing kind of like, I think, the exciting new projects into the marketplace, and it's the traditional folks who are becoming more and more like Hollywood and only doing the blockbusters. And the blockbusters are fine, you know, and they're still selling and they're doing what they're doing, but they've got a kind of formulaic thing going on to the extent that I think the much more interesting books that are being published are happening in small houses, and lots of times even among self-published authors. I was talking to a client this week who I always ask when I'm working with new clients, okay, well, do you have any ambitions to traditionally publish? Because I want to know where people stand when they start to work with me. And he said, oh, well, I just think it's a wall of impossibility. And I thought that was kind of a nice way to frame it. I was like, a wall of impossibility. To some extent, that's true. You know, you have to prove yourself first. And the people who are being traditionally published right now are already famous, or they have already proven themselves, right, in some sort of capacity. You know, maybe they have some huge successful TED Talk. Like, TED is the new Oprah, right? If you get these big deal kinds of things, you can open the doors to a traditional publishing deal, perhaps. That said, and I'm sure a lot of you agree with this assessment, like now that I've done my own books and I've published my own books on my own press, which is what we in this room do, I would never go back to traditional publishing. You know, the things that are broken with traditional publishing are significant, and the excitement and the editorial control and everything that we get to do on ourselves is part of the creative process, and it's awesome. So I personally love it. That said, one of the things that I go around talking about a lot, and I'm going to get into a little bit more in my workshop this afternoon, is publishing standards. Because I do think it's incumbent on all of us, you know, if we're going to be in this indie community, to keep and adhere to this gold standard of publishing, which the traditional folks are absolutely adhering to. So whether you have strong feelings about traditional publishing or not, they are publishing beautiful books, and they know what makes a good book cover, and they know how interiors are supposed to look, and they're not making some of the many mistakes that I see indie authors making all the time. Not always because, I would say it's like not always out of ignorance. You know, sometimes it's like you're not really doing the work that you're supposed to do of getting the, you know, maybe consulting with someone who might know better, or people who want to do DIY so much that they want to learn every single element of the publishing industry, when really there might be some things that should be outsourced to someone who knows that stuff better than you do. And so some of the work that we've been doing at the Independent Book Publishers Association is putting together a checklist, and I have the checklist for the workshop. And I can give you guys, you can download it from IBPA's website. But I think the checklist is important because the reason that we created it, and it's like a double-sided PDF file, you know, it's quite comprehensive in terms of what it is. But the idea behind this checklist is that if a non-involved party, like a bookstore owner or a reviewer, gets a book, and their responsibility is just to check off everything on the list. And then everything on the list qualifies a professionally published book. The takeaway from that should be that that's what matters and not the business model. You know, that we should be judging books on the quality of the book and whether they adhere to a traditional publishing standard, and not who you got published on. Because right now, this industry is so stuck in a pretty almost bipolar situation, right? With traditional publishing on one side and self-publishing on the other side. And even as the traditional industry is acknowledging, like, oh yeah, here's the self-publishing community and they're doing better and better work and self-published authors are making money, and we're poaching self-published authors. You know, despite all of that, there's still this very firm line in the sand that they have an investment in drawing and maintaining, because they actually don't want you detracting from their profits. And it's already happening. You know, the more books that are published, the problem on the traditional side, of course, is that they're not selling, they don't have the kind of breakout books that they used to have. They're not printing as high of print runs as they used to print, because the market is just saturated with so many more books, and readers have more opportunities. And so it's harder and harder to get a blockbuster, and I think that that's you know, in part, the industry's reaction to that has been to get less creative, which is a really interesting and frankly stupid strategy. And at the same time, they're freaking out a little bit. You know, what you're seeing is this consolidation all around of the traditional houses buying up, you know, all these small presses. And so like when I was at Seal Press, during my tenure there, we got bought by Perseus, which was kind of a mid-level company. And now Perseus has since been bought by Hachette, which is one of the big five. And you're just going to see, I really believe we'll see more and more of that. You know, we're going to see like a pretty clear, you know, the big five continuing to gobble up as much as they can on this side, and then the sort of firmly independent people, which is going to be small presses, including places like Grey Wolf, you know, and other small presses that kind of have a firm like, no, we want to be indie. And I think also these kind of smaller publishing entities. Now, my push for hybrid, and for those of you who might be thinking about making your presses a little bit more hybrid in nature, we have some things that qualify a hybrid. And I think that these are sort of important points for anyone who's maybe thinking like, oh, the hybrid model seems interesting to me, and there's lots of reasons why it should. Because A, it allows you to operate as more of a publisher. Like when you're doing self-publishing or assisted self-publishing, which is a super valid service, you know, there are good reasons to help people self-publish and to publish well, because we, you know, the notion that a rising tide, you know, lifts all boats, we want that. We want all self-published authors to publish well, because the more we do a good job in self-publishing, the less stigma is involved. You know, it is these authors, I call them the renegade authors, you know, who just are like, I don't know anything about publishing, but who cares? You know, I'll just go ahead and publish whatever I want. And the result of that, unfortunately, is all the mistakes that get made drag down all of us. You know, because they're still indie authors, and the industry is going, see, they don't do a good job. And so why should I pay attention to any indie authors? So there's a collected investment that we all have in self-publishing well and in helping others to self-publish, and so that's great. But because the barriers to entry are high for traditional authors, but they're also high for traditional publishers. Like when I set out to start my own publishing company, I looked at the idea of giving advances and royalties and was like, I couldn't even publish one book. I didn't have any money. You know, it's like it's not a viable business option unless you happen to be, you know, a multimillionaire or an heiress. And so because of that, you probably want to figure out a way to make money. And so what I like about the hybrid option, like when you're self-publishing and you're doing kind of paid service, right? Like, okay, well, here's the bid, and you can pay me X number of dollars for a cover, and you can pay me X number of dollars for a copy edit, all of which totally makes sense. And again, it's a service model. But with the way that we're doing it, publishing is just a single package cost. The author pays for that package, and then in exchange they get all these services, and then we keep a percentage of their royalties. But for us, the vast majority of those royalties go back to our distributor, Ingram. But if for those of you who are interested in kind of, you know, pushing your models more toward hybrid, it does require a little bit more of a consideration around active distribution. And as I have been working with the Independent Book Publishing Association to create these basically standards for what qualifies a hybrid press. And we do not believe that every hybrid press needs or wants traditional distribution. You know, and I'm happy to talk more about traditional distribution and sort of, you know, what that is in the Q&A if people are interested. But the traditional distribution system is where you have, you know, a traditional distributor who is pre-selling your book into the marketplace. And the issue for us is that they take a pretty high percentage. You know, they take up to 30% in commissions, which is significant, you know, if you're looking at the fact that we're only keeping 40%. So our margins then get really, really small when we're talking about traditional distribution, and it doesn't make sense for every author, and it doesn't make sense for every publisher or book. That said, for hybrid publishing, we do believe that there should be some sort of active distribution. You know, that it's more than just putting the book on Amazon. That in and of itself is a completely fine starting point. But as most of you probably understand, just putting the book on Amazon and then not doing anything else is like the most passive way to publish a book. And so in hybrid publishing, we're interested in this idea that publishers would have an investment in active distribution, putting on more platforms, and either supporting the author with some sort of marketing plan and or requiring the author to have some sort of marketing plan for the sake of pushing and promoting books so that the sales aren't just, you know, like 20 to 50 copies of, you know, who the author knows and can drive to Amazon. It has to be a little bit bigger than that. Another qualification of hybrid publishing would be that you act as a publisher, you know, that there be some sort of mission or some sort of mandate. It doesn't have to be altruistic, you know, but you should have a list that makes sense. And I think when you're starting self-publishing and helping other people publish, it's kind of whoever comes through the door, because it's a pay model, right? You're giving them a service, and it doesn't really matter who they are. You just want to help them publish a better book. A hybrid publisher, in our opinion, you know, as we're beginning to kind of set these parameters, would be that it makes sense to publish on your list, that you're curating a list, and also that you don't accept everyone. Or if you do accept everyone, that there be a very strong editorial vision. You know, that someone would come through your door, for instance, and you would say, wow, this book is not ready. And we will developmentally edit you, and we will put you through a rigorous process, and we will decide when you're published ready, are you available and on board to make that kind of commitment. Because this happens for us all the time. You know, we get authors who submit to us, and if their books are not ready, we don't actually reject them. We say, you can work with a developmental editor, you can work with a coach, but your book as it stands today is not publish ready. And someone at the helm of that company, ideally you know, or whoever the publisher is in your organization, would have the discernment, but also the, you know, the wherewithal and the confidence to be able to say that to people who are coming through your door. And I think that's another important aspect of what's happening here, because we have to reduce the number of books that are being published that aren't ready to be published. And it doesn't mean that, you know, all of the books that we're publishing are Pulitzer Prize quality. You know, like the novels that we have range from amazing, you know, like among the best books I've ever read, to decent, you know, like a pretty good novel, but not amazing. But I can stand behind the editorial quality and the story and know that I published something that I at least thought was publish ready. And I think there has to be a differentiation between, like, holy cow, this book is amazing, and publish ready. You know, and that you all can feel okay, like, I'm okay to publish the decent novels. I'm proud to publish the really amazing ones, but I'm not, excuse the double negative here, but I'm not proud to publish the decent ones, you know? And that is what keeps the list being generated, and also it's about quality. And I just think that as indie publishers in general, it does fall to us to be measuring the quality of the books that we're publishing in some capacity. And I think this is going to be the sea change in indie publishing in general. You know, that you move from this place of like, oh, you want to get published? Well, I'm just going to help you publish and I'm not even going to read your book. You know, and that happens. And that, you know, where someone says, oh, it's totally ready, and my daughter did the proofread, and, you know, it's excellent, and don't worry about it. And that's not enough if you're a hybrid publisher. You know, I have to stand behind the quality of all of my authors' work, and the buck does fall to me. I mean, if we get a bad review, it shines poorly on She Writes Press. And yes, it shines poorly on the authors, but a lot of times people will ask me, well, what's your investment? You know, like if the authors are paying you and we're making most of our money up front, you know, like what's your shared investment, right? What's the risk that you're taking as the publisher? And I always say, look, it's our brand. It's our logo that you're publishing on. And so whether we're making a little bit of money with you or breaking even, or in some cases even losing money, it matters to me, the publisher, that all of our books are books that I can stand behind and say, like, yes, this book is a She Writes Press book, and I believed it should have been published. And so as you all become, you know, whether you are or not yet, you know, I think some of you are, you know, more sophisticated publishers doing multiple titles, and some of you are probably, you know, self-publishing your own work and maybe thinking about gravitating toward that direction. But I think as you start to take on more and more projects, this question of your own discernment and your own willingness to stand behind your projects is what differentiates you as a pay-for-service provider and a publisher. And I would love, you know, I think that everybody in BAIPA and in, you know, IBPA, there's a progression, you know, because so many people start as authors and think of themselves as authors. You know, this next level to kind of move into really thinking of yourself as a publisher and what does that even mean is a pretty big deal. And I would love for everybody, you know, who is entering into the hybrid publishing space to take on the label and title of publisher. I think it's important that each of these companies, these hybrid publishing companies, have a publisher at the helm. So, let's see, how are we doing on time? Is this 1 hour?
1:15.
1:15. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna go for about 15 more minutes, and then I want to do Q&A, just because I think it's really important to hear what you guys want to think, and you know, Q&A can end up in a tangential direction where I do another like 5-minute answer. So I personally think that hybrid is the way of the future. That's where I'm at now. Looking around, I really don't see anyone except legitimately millionaires and heiresses starting publishing companies. You know, like the person, I believe it's Catapult, which interestingly just bought Counterpoint. I don't know if anybody follows, you know, who these small presses are, but Counterpoint is a small publishing company in Berkeley, and Catapult was this imprint out of New York. And the woman who started it, you know, like her dad is like one of the most wealthy men in, I think it's the automotive or oil industry or something.
KKR.
That's exactly right, yes. And so, of course she started a publishing company, right? I mean, this is like what people used to do in the early 1900s. You know, the men who started publishing companies, their dads were all railroad barons, and the boys were like, oh, we don't have anything to do. We want to, you know, rub shoulders with important people, and so we'll just start publishing companies. And that was what happened. You know, that's like the genesis of publishing. And so when you see today people starting real, you know, traditional publishing companies, that's a lot of what they're doing. And that's why I think that what's exciting about indie is that that's not what we're doing. You know, we're not necessarily trying to rub shoulders with people who are already famous. We're trying to discover new talent or publish something that should be published because we really believe in it. And I feel really passionately about this because when I was in traditional publishing, I'm sure you guys have heard of the term passion project. And the reason that passion projects exist is because they were the projects that the traditional houses were actually legitimately taking a risk on. You know, that they were just like, we love this so much that we're going to take a risk on it. And what I think is that most indie publishers, every project is a passion project. And that's an amazing way to do a business. It's also really hard to make money. Which is why the shared risk makes sense. And the shared risk part, you know, it's interesting because this whole hybrid scenario is an entrepreneurial model. And so for the authors who come into She Writes Press, they either already consider themselves entrepreneurial, or I try to get them to think about themselves as entrepreneurial publishers. And the reason that this is good is because they come in eyes wide open, you know, understanding that it falls to them to do the lion's share of the work. Like, what we're going to guarantee is that the work is publish ready, is that they can be really, really proud of their books, that they have a gorgeous cover and a flawless interior, and that their book will compete in the traditional marketplace. And then in addition to that, now that we have traditional distribution, we can also guarantee this open pipeline that is traditional distribution, and at least some amount of pre-selling opportunities. So the distribution for us has been kind of a game changer. It opens up more possibilities for the authors. It also opens up a ton more risk, because once you have traditional distribution, if any of you are interested in signing on for that, you also have to absorb returns. Many of you may already be accepting returns, you know, because you can't even get into bookstores if you don't accept returns. And this is another thing that you really want to think about with your own models, because I think the reason so many people want to sign with She Writes Press is because we can get into bookstores, libraries. We have a little more, I guess opportunity is the way I would frame it, because we're also qualifying to be reviewed traditionally. And in part, like I said, because of all these battles I fought. I mean, I can't tell you how much of my time has been spent talking to industry people about what's wrong with their thinking on hybrid publishing, and that they're really not being fair. You know, and many people see that and go, oh, well, that's actually really interesting. It's not fair, you're right. And then there are the holdouts, you know, who are just like, well, we have no other way to measure books besides, you know, just dividing you into these black and white categories of traditionally published or self-published, because they claim overwhelm. And I just think, of course, that that's a bullshit excuse. But we have to have better measures for them, because if they don't have better measures, then you can't respond to them by saying, well, actually, you know, overwhelm is not a good excuse, and here's the IBPA checklist, for instance, and all you have to do is check these boxes and then let the book speak for itself. Then you really can review something based on content alone. But anyways, circling back to sort of this notion of a hybrid as the wave of the future, you know, people who enter into this industry at this point are going to be entering in from some sort of hybrid model. And the exciting thing about hybrid is that you don't have to follow the exact model of She Writes Press. There are a number of hybrids out there in the world, and also people who are aspiring to change their business models from a more sort of self-publishing service provider model into something that looks more like a hybrid publishing company. Of course, if you do that, you have to have a few things in place. You know, you really ought to have a cover designer that you trust. You really ought to have, you know, some stable of editors who are going to do the work of making sure that your books are properly edited. You need to step up and really act as the publisher in those cases. And lots of times when I do these hybrid talks, people will say, well, how can you stand up to the authors if they're paying? You know, like, how can you tell them that, you know, they have to take your cover or they have to do this or that? And, you know, I guess I never thought about standing up to my authors, but I do. You know, I tell them a lot, like, no, you can't have this cover that you want because it's awful. And I'll say to them, like, you know, I'm sorry to be so blunt, but, you know, you are paying me for my expertise. And it's the other aspect of becoming a publisher that I think really will help, you know, just in terms of hybrid and indie in general, is trusting yourself to say, yes, they're paying you, but it is your job in many cases to save the authors from themselves. Because if they want to publish, you know, if they want to publish without any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, well, exactly. Like if they didn't want any advice, if they wanted to do it on their own, then they could just go ahead and do it on their own. But if they're coming to you and they're paying a publishing package and they're saying, I want to be on your list, and so that's the confidence that I have in pushing back. You know, where I'll say, you know, actually you are publishing with us because you wanted these services, and some of these services are trust us that we know the market. That said, of course we work with publishers. I want authors. I want all of our authors to love their covers. And it takes some explaining and not capitulating to every little whim that people might have because they don't totally understand the industry. And that's a tough thing to navigate. And it's why publishing, you know, being a publisher is a hard job sometimes. So as we look forward, you know, and as this middle space begins to grow, one thing that I want to say is that there's no necessarily one perfect, you know, check boxes that you guys have for your business models. You know, you can start almost anywhere you want and you can finesse that as you go. And in the workshop today, I'm going to talk a little bit through our contract, just to explain contractually the terms that we have and how we've set that up. But also, I know so many hybrid publishers that are doing things completely differently than we're doing them. And this has worked for us. I know hybrid publishing companies that are doing different royalty splits. You know, they're doing 50-50, that are charging more, that are charging less. And all the services that you offer, you know, you can offer more or less services. You can offer fewer or more packages. You know, there's so many ways to enter into this space. And what I like about hybrid is that I call it the gray zone of publishing, and in some ways I really love the gray. You know, I like that it's not just this, like, you're a hybrid publisher and you have to be, you know, like this. You can be however you want, but there will be these, you know, certain qualifications that will happen, like I was saying, you know, some form of active distribution and helping the authors understand the market so that there's a potential for higher sales, that there be a publisher and some kind of publishing mandate, that you have a mission statement of sorts, that you have an editorial vision, and that the book at least be publish ready, you know, so that you're doing some sort of assessment of the work, and in fact, you know, probably curating. Because I think it's another thing that really differentiates She Writes Press from other models that I've seen, is that we have a very clear curating process. You know, we have a submissions process that I modeled off of traditional publishing. And so all the ways in which She Writes Press is like traditional publishing is actually helpful, and it's very legitimizing. So it's not about, you know, bashing traditional publishing, because what's wrong with traditional publishing is actually not the products. You know, it's not the books as they come out and what they look like. It's the decision-making process all the way back at the point of acquisition that's the problem. And this fact that they have moved so much toward, you know, a brand focused and so sort of only personality and author focused, and so far away from content. So I am excited. You know, I'm excited about the future of hybrid. I love the idea of people entering into the hybrid space. I love the idea of anyone here who is currently doing more of like an assisted self-publishing model and thinking, oh, this is appealing to me. I would like to move my business model to look a little bit more like hybrid. And so for all of you, I have a Facebook page that's called Hybrid Publishers Unite. And if you can be in there, it's pretty new. I just started it like maybe 6 months ago. And so if you want to be a part of that, just let me know. I'll give my cards out later. And you can also find me on Facebook, Brooke Warner. And I think all that needs to happen is you would friend me and then send me a note that says I saw you at BAIPA and I'd like to be in that group. That's easy. And I would like more conversation about this. I mean, what's also exciting about it is that it is new. And yet I made the joke before that it's also like the least like new creative thing that's new, because traditional publishers have been doing this for a really long time and not talking about it. And the whole notion behind hybrid for me, like when I started this, I wasn't going, oh my gosh, I have this amazing new business model. No, North Atlantic Books, where I worked for 5 years, did contracts that they called co-publishing. And this is exactly what it was. It was a co-publishing contract where the author paid a certain amount, they paid for their print runs, and in exchange, they got a much higher royalty. So I was already very familiar with this, and so it was another reason I was somewhat surprised when I started getting so much pushback from the industry, and I was like, but wait. And then the more I talked to people, I heard, guess who else does these deals? Chronicle. And a number of high-level publishers who don't want to take the monetary risks on certain books, and the author is willing to come in with the money. And what they say is that, okay, we'll give up a higher percentage of our royalty because you're bringing the dollars. And that is a hybrid arrangement or a co-publishing arrangement or a partnership arrangement or whatever the heck you want to call it. And, the industry wants to, again, kind of take that holier than thou viewpoint of like, oh no, there's this and there's that. But it's not that way. It's not black and white, and publishing has never been black and white. And so what hybrid is just kind of being transparent about something that's always been there. So I welcome questions. I think is that fine to move to Q&A?
Whenever you would.
Okay, perfect.
So hold on a second.
Oh, we got a mic runner.
Because, to be honest, we would all like to hear you, but also the little camera up front already.
So I believe you said that your royalty for print books is 60% of the net.
Net receipts, right.
How do you go about calculating the net?
Ooh, I have to pull out my contract. I mean, we define what net receipts are, and it was a little technical for me to just recite that off the top of my head, but it is, what is it? Oh my gosh. We'll look at it in the workshop, or afterward I can pull up my contract and show you. But basically it's after expenses, right? So it's on list price minus
Printing costs?
the printing cost comes out after for us, because this might not be the case for all publishers, but in our case the authors are paying for the print run, and so the net receipts don't include the print run. Because since the authors pay for the print run, that's not a cost that is our cost, and therefore it's not associated. And so when they get their, however many dollars they're getting per unit, they have to then subtract their $2 or $3 per unit print run from that total. Yeah.
But what are your costs then?
What are our costs?
Yeah.
Let's see. Our costs are, what we're doing is we take like a $16.95 book, that's how much ours, but for the sake of this exercise, let's call it $20 because it's easier. So Amazon or any bookstore, we're doing the 55% discount, which is required if you want to be in bookstores, and that is what Amazon takes. For those of you who have done self-publishing, and maybe you have done a lower percentage. I've seen lots of self-published authors who do 30% or whatever because they want to make more money, but then you can't get into bookstores and you can't get into a lot of venues. So if you set the 55% discount to retailers, then what you're on that $20 book, what we're getting back is 45%. So what's the math on that? Is that $9? Okay, so $9, we are splitting 60-40.
Got it.
Okay, and then the authors have to subtract their manufacturing costs from their 60%. And then there are a few fees, but that's not coming out of the royalty costs. So we really are splitting basically after the retailer takes their cut.
Okay.
And that's what we would consider our net receipts. But sometimes those discounts can be as much as 60%. It can vary a little bit. And then our authors have to pay for returns. That's one thing that we had taken into consideration, because when a book gets returned, Ingram charges us a 50-cent restocking fee. So 50 cents per unit to restock the book, but the good news is that that book goes back into inventory. If you don't pay the 50% restocking fee, the book gets destroyed. So it's not great, but it's a cost that we pass back to the authors, and that has been effective for us.
Peter?
Okay. Oh, sorry.
One of the most interesting things I heard you say was the prejudice against indie publishers. I've been in the business about close to 50 years.
Yeah, I know you.
And when I started, I was part of the West Coast publishing boom,
Right.
which we were known as small presses to
Right.
New York, but that didn't fit because the small presses were really tiny and literary. So we called ourselves independent presses.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there was prejudice. We couldn't get our books reviewed, and we weren't considered real publishers.
Right.
But we published commercially, and we published mission-driven. And eventually those prejudices went away, and now you've inherited them.
Yes, thank you. It's interesting because I think you're right, and I know we both know Susan Reich, and she said to me when I first came and started working for PGW, I was embarrassed about the books because she came from New York publishing, right? But then over time that shifted for her, because the books got better and the indie publishers were doing better work and they were getting more commercial and they were getting it. And that is what we need to do now as indie authors, because what has happened, and it obviously is getting better, but there are many self-published books that are embarrassing. And I would love a future where that's not the case anymore. But people have to be, this is an amazing group, right? Because you have these resources and people want to learn and they want to reach these certain standards. But there's always that question of how to reach the rest of the people who are indie publishing to say, this actually is an industry that has standards and we have to do a better job. Because the thing is, I will never be, She Writes Press will never be a traditional publisher. And we can do a good job, but we're not going to be embraced in that space. And now what I think has happened is that those original indie publishers are more embraced as indie darlings, of the publishing world, because they still do the traditional royalties and, are paying advances even if they're small. But there's a lot of houses like Akashic, for instance, who are doing 0 advance and 50-50 on royalties. And so there's, those people I think are kind of skating a line, okay, because it's all about business model now in terms of how you qualify different presses. But thank you for the inheritance.
Hi, so am I hearing that when the author pays for the print run,
Right.
Are you doing print on demand at all, or is it all offset that sits in your warehouse?
So when I first started, we were doing almost exclusively POD, and that has shifted to almost exclusively offset now. And the thing that shifted it for us was traditional distribution, because Ingram has a warehouse, and so it's not my warehouse, and I get to just use their warehouse, and that's great. And because of pre-selling, that the books have to be pre-sold into the marketplace, we have to cover our pre-orders. And those pre-orders, even when they're very low, are like 150 to 200. And oftentimes they're more like 500 to 600. By the time you are looking at a 500 print run, offset is cheaper than POD. And so most of our books start with an offset run, usually 500 to 2,000, and then some authors reprint, but very few. Most then move to POD. So a very typical way of us doing business is 1,000 print run. If and when those books sell through, and it's time to reprint because we're low on inventory, I will tell the author, let's do 200 through Ingram on POD. So that we're replenishing. It technically is a print run because we're not flipping the book to be filled to order, but we are doing POD, fulfilling like 200 copies at a time also because it's cheaper, you know, like if the difference between 200 books POD versus one at a time, you still save like pretty significantly, almost sometimes like 50 to 60 cents per unit. So this is the problem with POD, is the true fulfill to order, one unit at a time, is really cost prohibitive. And I'm still figuring that out, but most of our authors, as we fulfill like 100 to 200 at a time. I'm trying to almost do no straight ahead POD because of cost.
Can you define POD just quickly, most of our people know, but just so you know?
Yeah, just so print on demand. I mean, the interesting thing about print on demand is that it's both a printing technology, which is very straightforward. It's a way of printing books. But the other part that is more complicated is that it's a status. So if your book's status is print on demand, that is somewhat problematic and marks you as a self-published author. You know, because if you are being fulfilled print to order and you have no inventory in your warehouse, bookstores can tell on the back end that you're POD. That's what I mean by status. They go into their systems and they go, oh, you have zero inventory. You know, so your book isn't warehoused, it's print on demand, and then they're kind of equating that with self-published authors, and lots of times as a result they're not ordering. And so this is another area where